IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Atish Padhy, and today I'm joined by Rohan, Seth and Prateek, Waghre, and we will be talking about the Facebook Oversight Board, which is an independent body of experts that reviews some of Facebook's most controversial and difficult content moderation decisions and tells them whether or not they got it right. So, Rohan, I want to start with you. Why don't you lay out what exactly the board independence means? How is it that it can continue to be independent while also being constituted by Facebook? And how it navigates the conflict between being constituted by Facebook and also being expected to remain independent? Because we have heard that Facebook itself has referred to it as the Supreme Court of Facebook, but according to many, it can also appear to be just a PR machine where Facebook can legitimize itself better.
Okay, there are a lot of things in this question. Let me try to answer them one by one. So let's talk about what the Oversight Board does first, right? It is the Oversight Board's limited duty to ensure that Facebook's rules and processes are consistent with its content policies, its values, and human rights commitments. Right? So it needs to make sure that decisions such as the one of banning Donald Trump are consistent with the policy that Facebook has laid out for its platform. Right? In how it is independent, I think it's quite a fascinating model. What Facebook has basically done is created a trust. It has allocated X amount of money for that trust. I think the amount of money is $130 million. It's somewhere in that ballpark. I think the exact figure we can correct later. But the basic thing is it's given this money, and I think it should be enough to last them for 4 to 5 years. And so it doesn't need a lot from Facebook to continue working. The thing is, when this board was constituted, it was constituted by, I think, really eminent personalities. I think someone is also representing India in the board, and also there's a former Prime Minister of Denmark, and so on. So it's quite a collection of people that they have there. I think when this was constituted, we said that because the board will only take a few cases, it is really going to be a big challenge for them to scale this. Having said that, the board can still do meaningful work when it takes cases such as those of Trump or cases that are, to set a precedent for Facebook to follow. And so that is basically what the board is, what it's supposed to do, and how it remains independent. Having said that, I don't think it's going out exactly as planned, not least because the challenges, at least in the context of this Donald Trump ban that have been presented to the board, haven't exactly been what exactly it was set out to do. So that's sort of where we are right now. I think this Donald Trump journey is going to take some time to get resolved, and the board has an instrumental role to play in that. But it's not limited to just that. I think there are a couple of cases from India that we will also talk about later on. But that's a broad overview for the board.
And if I can just add, right, I think since we last spoke about the Oversight Board, it was only looking into cases where content had been taken down, right? And that was a point I think that we went back and forth on. Like, look, this is fairly limited, right? I think in April they've since expanded that, and they can also now look at content that has stayed up and should have been taken down. Although, as of now, they haven't yet taken up any such cases. But that expansion in remit, I think, is interesting, right? And it goes some way in addressing some of the questions about the utility of the board or how effective it can be, or the legitimacy, right? And which is also a conversation that you can't ignore, right? When we're talking about the oversight board, it is steeped in this very political face-off between, as you were mentioning, Atish, is it legitimate, or is it just a PR machinery, right? For Facebook to whitewash things, and that those dynamics are always at play, right? And there is a constant back and forth between people who've made up their minds, right, on whether the board is legitimate or not. And then, no matter what the board does, it just goes to further strengthen that opinion or that belief that's already been made of. It's, everything with the oversight board. You also have to look at the surrounding politics, and all of that makes it, a little bit of content moderation theater that we all sit back and watch.
All right, so we will go into all the three cases that Rohan mentioned, one with the infamous Donald Trump decision that it made, and two cases specific to India. But before that, on the point that you were mentioning, Prateek, about how the Oversight Board has revised its mandate and increased, in fact, the kind of cases it looks at. One of the criticisms that came in after it formulated its first bunch of decisions back in January was that this board is full of free speech absolutists who do not want anything to be taken down. And now, so far, they haven't really considered a case where a post was taken up that has been taken down yet, if I'm not wrong. And so we don't really have the context to make a very informed opinion about that. But do you think that criticism is very valid about them being a bunch of free speech absolutists that do not want anything to be taken down?
I mean, look, there are a lot of people on that board, right? I think it's a little unfair to paint it in such broad strokes. But if you look at the history, I think they've tended towards overturning Facebook's decision in terms of asking them to put content back up, right? So they certainly seem to lean towards keeping content up rather than taking it down so far, right? Like you said, we don't know how. They haven't yet taken up a case where content should have been taken down, so we don't know. Current record seems to suggest that they favor keeping content up, but I think it's a little probably going too far to just say that, look, this is a bunch of free speech absolutists and they will make sure they'll just want everything to stay up, right? I think we need to look at it with a little more nuance than that.
All right, so now let's focus on the Donald Trump case first and get it out of the way. So as our listeners would be aware, Donald Trump was banned from Facebook indefinitely following the riots in the Capitol building in the United States. And the Oversight Board's decision in early this month was very interesting, to say the least, because what they essentially do in that decision, from what I understand, is they simply ask Facebook to create a proper policy about important people, or what they call newsworthy people, and how their content should be treated. And they do not really make any specific recommendations as to what Facebook should do with Donald Trump. And they just send it back. So Rohan, firstly, what are your comments on the kind of decision that was taken, which seems to me to be very just washing your hands off the responsibility of deciding on Donald Trump's future on social media? And secondly, just whether Facebook achieves what it sought out to achieve with the Oversight Board, if the Oversight Board is not going to help them frame policy around such controversial decisions.
Okay, this is a bit broad, but let me begin with a metaphor. I was actually telling this to Prateek on a conversation earlier in the day. But think about this Donald Trump case as two people, right? One of them is Facebook, the other one is the Oversight Board. And Facebook has a really hot potato in its hands. What it does is it's getting really uncomfortable to hold this hot potato. So it tries to hand it over to the Oversight Board. The Oversight Board's people, they take the potato and they're sort of insulted that Facebook would even ask them to do this. And after that, they hand the potato back to Facebook. Okay, I would say not hand. They throw the potato back to Facebook and basically say, you come back to me when you've figured out what to do with this. Let me sort of now add a little more nuance to this metaphor. It is the board's, as I said, it's the board's limited duty to say whether or not a decision is actually consistent with Facebook's values, right? Here, the thing that the board doesn't actually agree with is that there's not a policy in the community guidelines of Facebook that supports an indefinite ban, right? And Facebook has gone ahead and done that anyway. And while the board agrees that Facebook was right to ban Trump, the ban shouldn't be indefinite. That's at least what the board believes. I differ in that because they say the board says you can have a ban that sort of is not indefinite. You ban him for 6 months. After 6 months, he comes back. And if there is a repeated offense, you ban him for 6 more months. To me, that's giving Donald Trump a platform every 6 months. And I think it's sort of, not just Donald Trump, but it's sort of making the situation a little bit worse every time. The board also asked Facebook about the extent to which the platform's design decision, including algorithms, policies, procedures, and technical features, amplified Trump's posts. And Facebook declined to answer these questions, which is very interesting to me because, not least because if I were the board, I would have liked to see that. And so that's the broad context of where we are right now. And I really think that this matter is going to be picked up again in 6 months' time.
Yeah, so therefore, what you're trying to say is that the board is unwilling to frame the policy for Facebook in Facebook's behalf, and they want to stick to their limited duty that they will only be reviewing decisions and are not going to be like, to use the analogy that Facebook used, they're not going to be a legislative body, but will remain a Supreme Court, right?
That's, I think, the broad idea, and I think you've summed it up really well. I do think that the board has decided that this is not somewhere that they can win. And let me try to answer this way. Right? The board says there is basically no precedent in Facebook's policies. And what Facebook needs to do is to figure it out and come back later to come up with a solution. That is one way to do things. The other way, according to me, is to say, well, look, you've got this problem, and how about you actually carve out a policy? Because this clearly is a situation that has arisen once, has led to consequences that were quite disastrous, and can come again. And it is fascinating to me that they haven't actually said, how about you revise your policy and come back to us? Instead, they've said something, they basically said that you tell me that indefinite bans are not okay. So what is the solution here? And to me, the fact that they're not hinting towards a policy that should ideally be expanded. And I think the policy here is bear with me while I pull this up. It is the Community Standard on Dangerous Individuals and Organizations. I don't think that Donald Trump is the only case that's going to exist that can lead to disruption of some sorts. And I don't think this is the first time Facebook's gotten itself into this mess. So the fact that they haven't asked for this policy to be revised itself is sort of a sticking sore thumb in my opinion.
Yeah, but I think, if I can just build a little bit of that, right? I think the idea there, right, or what they seem to be suggesting is, look, this is the job of your policy team. They need to do it, right? We're not going to sit and craft your policies for you. I still think Facebook can go back and say, okay, look, we're changing our policy, right? I don't think anything the board says precludes that course of action for Facebook, should they choose to take it, right? I think they seem to have, as you suggested, stopped short of hinting or pointing in that direction, sort of a nudge, wink type of scenario. But I think that course of action is still available to Facebook if they want to go down that route. Like I said,
yeah,
right,
sure.
Donald Trump this was not the first case that happened. It happened in multiple countries before. It's just that this one happened to get a lot more attention. But and I still think the onus is very much on Facebook to define its own policies, right? In that, and especially if the board to be seen as an independent, legitimate, separate organization, right?
Can I just add to this a little bit to basically define my point, which is that while I'm reading this document, I of course use a tablet and a pencil to highlight my notes, and And you can see in the document that I start getting frustrated. I keep saying that, how about you ask them to just basically revise this policy and see where they are? How about you ask them to revise this and maybe change the policy here? And if I, as a policy analyst in a different country, I'm constantly getting cues that maybe this is where they should have asked Facebook, I am sure that 20 people sitting on that board, who are, of course, a lot more knowledgeable than I am on issues of speech and so on, are also sort of dabbling with the same idea. And also, can I suggest that I don't know if they are following a court's, I don't know, nomenclature or not, but generally when you see court orders, there are dissents that you see, right? So you'll say that this judge dissented, did not agree. They don't exactly have dissents. What they do have are minority views. They say that a minority believes X and X. If only they don't, of course, cite who the members of the minority are, because they might be at the risk of physical harm, I imagine. But my basic point is that they could have also just mentioned that a minority believes that they should have this policy be revised, and they've taken the option to not do that. And to me, I don't know what message it sends to me. It just seems like a peculiar event. So yes, Facebook still does have that option, as Prateek said. The fact that they haven't actually given that or nudged them in that direction, even though I keep shouting in that document while I'm reading it to do that, I think it really says something. I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, I think on that I'm with you, right? I'm certainly curious to understand why they chose not to say it. Right? And I think the other point about this case that was interesting, right, was in the build-up to the decision actually coming out, it was being portrayed as, look, this is going to impact, political leaders all over the world, right? This decision could have significant implications for that. And Rohan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the sense I get is that they seem to have sidestepped that question altogether.
Yes and yes. I will tell you why. Because first of all, there is not a decision. There is a lack of a decision. Right? The decision is Facebook. You figure it out. Come back in 6 months. Secondly, the one defining thing that could have actually sort of impacted more stuff is that Facebook asks in the report to tell them what the definition of a political leader is. Now, I don't think it's up to the board to define what a political leader is, but the board goes ahead and says that, listen, we don't think that there is a difference between an influencer or a political leader. And what that means is that, and I think they're right to say that, because I'm not sure if we can actually categorize influencers in different buckets. So I don't think a political leader and influencer are completely different things. For example, if that was the case, I'm not sure what bucket do you put Kangana in, right? I am not exactly sure that influencers never say political stuff, right? Maybe Akshay Kumar sometimes decides to say political stuff, or what if an influencer decides to support a political party in India or abroad, right? The distinctions are not very clear. And the board is right to say that. They don't say it in as many words, but what they basically say is that it's not up to us to define a political leader. And just so we are clear, there is not a lot of difference between an influencer and a political leader. And I think that is the only broad implications that you can apply to other sort of cases, because the other decision is still to come, right? We've still got 6 months to wait before we can figure out if there is a broader implication here.
If I may comment at this point, I was thinking, even though there might not be a difference between an influencer and a politician in what they say, for example, it might be a difficult line to draw. It's still more or less obvious who a politician is from knowing that they have been elected or ruling using the political institutions of a specific country, right? So at the very least, there can be a distinction based on that. For example, as you said, Kangana Ranaut will not claim to be a politician unless she starts running in an election in India, for example. So even at least on that basis, there seems to be, to me, a good reason for them to distinguish the two, because banning Kangana Ranaut and banning Donald Trump appear very different in the sense that she is an actress and he is the elected leader of a free country. So I actually think that is a big miss for them, because they could have still tried to draw such a distinction.
But I do think it's a very hard distinction to draw, right? When you sometimes take specific examples, that distinction becomes clearer, right? But it's not always the case, right? You cannot you can't really predict when an influencer is going to say something political, right? Or you say something about another events in another country, right? That may not be political in India. It may be political in another country. So it's extremely hard to draw that line. I am not envious of anyone who has to do that. It doesn't seem like an easy task at all, because the whole thing is, social media affords, so you can say anything you want, right, on any issue you want. And just because you don't happen to run for an you don't run an election, you can still take part in political speech, you can comment on political events, you can be a political commentator. So there's a whole range of things, right? And then just I think in London elections you had two YouTubers running, right? Now they were influencers until they decided to run for an election, and they will probably go back to being influencers because they will not win the election, right? But there are cases where certain QAnon influencers or QAnon linked influencers have won elections in the US as well. So it's not that easy to draw that line when you're looking at it from the perspective of, look, what harm is this speech causing, right? Because in when you look at it from that lens, there is equal potential for someone who is quote unquote a politician, member of a political party running elections, versus someone who just happens to have a lot of followers, right? Both of them have, to use common parlance, both of them have big megaphones, and they can do damage. So it's not that. Yeah, I went off on a little bit of a rant here, but basically, it's a very hard distinction to draw, right? And
So to just sum this up, I would just say that I think the categories of a political influencer and an influencer seem to be fairly neat, nice buckets. I don't think real life reflects that. I think the gray area is a lot bigger than you would think, and because of that distinction, I think platform functioning can be severely impacted and can lead to consequences that I don't think would be good for any party involved.
yeah, like for example, if Rohan starts tweeting about politics, he becomes a political influencer, right? Right now, he's just an influencer.
That's true. Yeah. But yeah, I think as far as the broader implications of the space go, I think we are yet to truly feel the ramifications of it.
All right. So moving on from the Donald Trump case then. So there were two very interesting cases that the Oversight Board picked up from India. One that it decided on in February and the other in late April. The first of these cases, and I'll read out the case description from the Oversight Board. In October 2020, a Facebook user posted in a public group that was supposedly a forum for Indian Muslims. Now, this post contained a meme featuring an image from a famous Turkish television show, which in English is called Resurrection Ertugrul, in which one of the show's characters is wearing a leather armor and holding a sword, which is still in its sheath. And the meme had a text in Hindi, but Facebook's translation in English reads, "If the tongue of the kafir starts against the prophet, then the sword should be taken out of the sheath." And this post also included hashtags directed towards the French President Emmanuel Macron as the devil and calling for the boycott of French products. So this was taken down by Facebook and was eventually referred to the board. And the board in its decision says that it does not find it violating any of Facebook's community standards under violence and incitement, and that it does not qualify as a veiled or implicit threat. But an interesting thing about this case is that a minority within the board actually found it to be a veiled threat. Now, this raises multiple questions, primary among which is how difficult is it to draw the line between what is explicit threat and what is an implicit threat and what qualifies as an implicit threat? Because there are so many instances where it will be entirely impossible to tell that distinction unless you have the entire context of the post.
Yeah, so I mean, look, again, it's also a very hard thing to define what is the veil threat, right? But it also looks, there are certain frameworks, right? You have things like the dangerous speech framework. I think in this case, they specifically mentioned, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the name, but the Rabat plan of action, right, which lays out six things that you need to look at, right? So there are some frameworks that you can use to define it, right? It's not really an easy thing to do, and again, it seems to go back to the point you raised earlier about the board wanting to err on the side of keeping things up. And it's also notable, right, that in the responses that came in, and this is also mentioned on the decision page itself, under the third party commenters, they basically said that a lot of context is unknown, right? They also don't know whether this post was made deliberately to spread a certain, or to give credence to a certain stereotype that Indian Muslims are violent, right? To propagate that harmful stereotype, and that was actually one of the comments that they received, right? So it's so they seem to have come to that conclusion based on the Rabat Plan of Action, and I think the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right? That they've looked into.
Interestingly, the comment that you mentioned, that comment itself said that the post should stay down and should not go up because it furthers the dangerous perceptions of Indian Muslims. But the board decided in its final decision that it does not qualify as a veiled threat because all the hashtags and even the expression using the meme still comes under a non-violent way of protesting against some of President Macron's comments in France. So
and I think they also made reference to the fact that, look, this was not directed at events in India particularly, right? It was someone protest. It was directed against what the French president said, and this was a specific response to, I think, Facebook's contention that there are heightened religious tensions in India, and the board, I think, basically said that, look, this is not an India specific thing, right? Which is interesting, because if you look at it from the perspective of spreading a harmful stereotype, and again, then you have to buy into that theory that this was maybe a false flag kind of post, right? Which, to be clear, there is no evidence of, or that's not been investigated in any meaningful way. So we can't really make that claim.
But on that point, the minority decision states that they actually commend Facebook for using a third party. So an essential part of this case was that Facebook uses a third party within its network of experts, NGOs, and a lot of these different places spread across the world to find the specific context to these cases. So they use one of these third parties to get us more specific context of the case and then take it down. As you mentioned, Facebook says that given the tensions in India, it was wise for them to take it down. And the minority actually comments that. And the majority opinion does not believe that is the case. So do you not think that this was, even if they were disagreeing with what Facebook did, this was a good chance for the oversight board to actually reinforce some of the good things that Facebook has done, which is come up with a network which provides them with better context of taking such a decision? Because without the context, this can seem to be it can either seem to be a very violent, depending on where you stand, to be a very violent meme or to be entirely harmless, but the context is extremely important. So do you think that is another missed opportunity for the board? Because it really doesn't seem to be very helpful to Facebook again.
Yeah, again, I think you have to go back to the larger picture, right, of the environment it's operating in, where it's constantly trying to prove its legitimacy, right? And I think that the lines read, right, the minority view sort of commends Facebook for that decision, and I guess that's the amount of commendation they're willing to give it. Right? I don't know if they wanted to, and I can only guess here, right? That they probably didn't want to go overboard in their praise of Facebook. I think they've acknowledged the fact, they've mentioned it, probably decided that that was good enough. Which, and I think that's okay, right? I don't necessarily know whether they had to make a bigger deal of that, because again, I think that's something that Facebook should be doing anyway, in the sense of trying to understand, local context and local nuance of when dealing with such issues. So again, how much do you want to praise someone for doing something that's expected of them, and they're already late to doing it, right? At the risk of sounding overcritical of Facebook.
Right. So another interesting thing that I noticed in the decision was one of the recommendations was that Facebook should make their community standards for incitement of violence extremely clear to everyone, make it public so that everyone is aware of the implications of it and it is easy to understand and all of that. And you have previously written and spoken about on All Things Policy about transparency theater and about how transparency can often be more of a distraction than a solution. So, what do you think about their recommendation of transparency in this specific case?
So it again, look, in such a case, right? Transparency is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's in the sense that, look, you're telling Facebook to define its policies clearly. Now, again, there's also a broader philosophical question here, right? Whether you subscribe to the fact that, look, should Facebook even be deciding these things, right? And there are very divergent opinions on that, right? But let's deal with the world we're in, which is Facebook is making decisions on this sort of content day in and day out, hundreds and thousands of pieces of such content. In that sense, it's not. I don't think it's unfair to ask them to be clear about the decisions. I will acknowledge that it's not an easy thing to do, right? It's very hard to prescribe these, to be very prescriptive when you're framing such rules. I mean, for example, even if you read laws that countries come up with, they are not very specific, right? A lot of them tend to be overbroad and vague in the way they define things, right? So it's not easy to pinpoint these definitions. On the larger point of transparency and us avoiding a trap there, is that comes from the perspective of, look, if we keep asking these platforms for transparency, this and that, right? It's not that hard for them to turn that around and say, look, here's a ton of data. Now you go and figure out what to do with it, right? It's something like that. Right? You can imagine it being weaponized in that way. So the idea is that you don't just stop at transparency. You need to come at some sort of meaningful transparency. And I know, and I'm using the word meaningful when it's not really been defined yet, right? And I think that's something that has to be defined. We also have to come up with things of how we want these companies to be transparent. But there's a bit of a chicken and egg here, because today we don't even have enough data or enough information to ask them that, hey, you should be transparent in this way or that way. So it's not going to be an easy thing to get at, right? And I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth, a lot of noise over the next couple of years, at least, for us to get this right. But it's important to be mindful of that there are pitfalls and we should avoid. We need to avoid them.
Right. It's just that to me, it seems like a lose-lose proposition for Facebook anyway, because if they are asked to make it public, make their specific standards for what qualifies as a threat, as a veiled threat, it is very difficult for them to do so, because as I previously mentioned, and as both of you also mentioned, that context is extremely important. And so where they draw the line will depend a lot on the context. It depends on which varies for each case. So they cannot really come up with a line in the sand where they can say, no, this is a veiled threat. So the way they will have to go about defining it would have to be based on other methods, like if it is reported these number of times, or if we use our various networks and then we find out that this is violative. And in order to do that, they would again have to go in and define who are in these networks and how much influence they have. So then it again becomes like too much data, or it just seems to me that Facebook seems to be in a lose-lose proposition in this case if they're asked to make it public.
I think there's a bit of we sort of need to understand why these policies exist in the first place, which is that they're not necessarily there for the community to read. They are there so that if there is, let's say, if something bad happens on the platform, Facebook can point to these things and say, listen, it's you violated X and X, and so you need to be kicked out, or X action needs to be taken against you, which is fine. The point here is that generally they have been fairly, how do I describe this in the most apolitical way? They've been fairly non-forthcoming in how they are implemented. I say that because if you look at the Donald Trump case, the board asks them, what actions exactly did you take to basically see how this content is spreading? And they decline to comment, which I think is a fairly significant decline, not least because then there is a lot less for the board to build its case off on. When you don't know what Facebook has done, you can't actually say what Facebook should have done, right? And in Facebook's defense, you need to have some sort of, what's the word I'm looking for here? You need to have some sort of discretion in how you implement this, because to a certain extent, these policies can cover a lot of ground, but at the same time, the real world is a lot more complex. And I don't think one of 5 policies can generally apply to all situations. And that's why this discussion is necessary. I'm not exactly sure what the facts are in the case here, in the Indian, French, and Turkish case. But the basic idea is that these policies exist to serve Facebook, not for people to read out. And that's just the harsh truth here. And the second thing is that without this discussion and this obfuscation, it's going to become hard for Facebook to moderate this stuff. And so that's why this opacity exists. And that's why it might take Facebook for some time to budge and change here.
Yeah, and I'm going to skip ahead, right, just to build off that point, because what Rohan said about Facebook declining to provide information also applied to the second case, right, where a video was taken down, and one of the angles that the board was investigating was whether the policy in question, which was the dangerous individuals and organizations policy, was disproportionately affecting minority speech, right? And in that context, Facebook seems to have declined to provide information related to legal requests that it may have gotten, which was also interesting, right? In the sense that they do tend to obfuscate where they can. Now you can rationalize that as, hey, this is how companies will behave. They will try to protect their interests, just as Rohan said, these policies exist to a large extent to protect their interests. Or you can try and get them to change, right? And I think that's where a significant amount of effort is being directed.
Yeah. So on that second case, which concerns a video from Global Punjab TV that was posted, it is 17 minutes long, and it was taken down because it said something like the RSS is a new threat and BJP has moved towards extremism, and it warned people that there would be a repeat of 1984 kind of riots that the BJP is planning, and therefore it should be boycotted and all of that. But this video was taken down after a single report, apparently, and Facebook then later reinstated the video. It put it back up, but by then the board had already taken it up, and they decided to go ahead with it anyway. Right? So what does it tell us about how rigorous Facebook's reviewing process is if a single report and then by the recommendation of a single human reviewer, video is taken down that is 17 minutes long?
Yeah, so and again, so this was on the, like I said, it was on the dangerous individual and organizations policy, which Facebook says it tends to be overcautious about, right? And I think to some extent that's understandable. But their response or their submission seemed to suggested that the person reviewing it made an error, may not have watched the entire 17 minutes of the video, and they weren't also later they weren't able to point out which part of those which section of that 17-minute video could have resulted in someone tagging it under this policy, right? And again, you also have to keep in mind that this was around a time when content moderation teams were working at lower capacity than usual, etc. Right? And there are there is a ton of content that needs to be moderated on platforms every day, and there is a very real worry of, on the one side, there is the broader, there's the conversation of working conditions for content moderators, then there's the question of the fact that Facebook's policies are ever changing, right? So it's not easy the guidance that's given to them is not necessarily always consistent, very easy, very binary for them. That's required for them to make such decisions on a basis. So human error is bound to creep in, right? There's also the other worry of anything that's community reported is vulnerable to weaponization, right? And we know it happens, right? That you have targeted reporting of voices that you don't want or that you want to silence. So that happens, right? And we don't know how how robust their internal processes are, how well they can handle these sort of coordinated operations, if I can call them that. And again, that again goes back to the point of, look, we don't know. We can draw conclusions based on one incident here and there, right? For like you said, in this case, it was a single report. If you go back to March, I think, where the hashtag Sikh was blocked. Even at that time, it seemed to be a single report, right? It was again blocked in June. At that time, Facebook statement seemed to indicate that it was multiple reports, right? So we don't really know that, right? We're clutching at straws until we actually know more.
So so to wrap up, all these three cases are specific pieces of content over which decision was made, right? So do you think going forward, the Oversight Board has, or should it increase its capacity, increase its purview to looking at something more broad, like, as you mentioned, the blocking of the Sikh hashtag? Because currently there is nothing within the board's mandate that also says that similar piece of content should be reinstated. So if they make a decision regarding this meme about that was posted in the Indian Muslims public group, if similar memes were posted elsewhere and they were taken down, nothing in the decision says that they should also go up. So going forward, what are the challenges that they might face if they're trying to do that, and whether they should be trying to do that? Because I think that would be more valuable than what it currently is, which seems to be more of like a case study kind of a thing, where they're just reviewing individual content instead of looking at maybe some of the more broader policies.
Look, the power of the board is fairly narrow, right? The idea is that Facebook says we will do whatever the board says in that one particular piece of content that it's looking at. What Facebook then says that if there is similar content, we will try our best to implement the recommendation. So basically, have it act like a precedent to other similar pieces of content. Of course, Facebook can't guarantee, and I don't know if it's because if it's technically possible, technically impossible, or so on. But what it can't do is that it can't guarantee that this thing is going to set a precedent from here on out. Not least because what if tomorrow the board says that it's an X type of posts, or maybe if it just says posts are bad and thus you should now cancel the newsfeed. That would, of course, not be something that Facebook will be willing to do. Right? So, should the purview of the board increase? I don't think I can conclusively answer that, because the board itself is an entity that will change over time and its values will change over time. And I don't think it's the most scalable way to handle a platform. Is it going to increase? I highly doubt it. That's because I don't think Facebook is going to give up as much power by saying that, listen, everything that you tell us to do will be acted across all pieces of content. Not just because it may not be technically feasible to do that for billions of pieces of content, but also because I feel like Facebook doesn't have a lot to gain if it does that, to answer your question.
Cool. Thank you very much for joining me today, Prateek and Rohan. We will see you again next episode. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for having us.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I would like to thank the sponsors of the network this week, Cred, Seth, and PayPal. Thank you so much. You make everything possible. Before I recommend a couple of episodes, I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about Ankush Champanerkar. Ankush was a team member who we lost due to COVID-related complications. He was a really fun guy, and I wish I knew him better than I got to know him in the short time he was with us. But I hope that you can remember him in your thoughts and prayers. Also, quick reminder about Pod for Change, the initiative set up by the podcasting community, along with Give India, the NGO partner. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and I'm sure that it would be much appreciated any donations that you could give. With that, let me quickly give you a couple of highlights from this week. Aditi Mittal was on Cyrus Says. Great episode, do check that out. On the Habit Coach, Ashton talks about using the word impossible and suggests some better alternatives. On Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Harsh Lal, the co-founder of the Soul Store. On This Round is on Me, Gauri talks to Pankit Desai, who is the co-founder and CEO of Secure Tech. And finally, I'd like to mention that we have a new show called Tere Mere Raste, hosted by Keshav Chaturvedi. This time it's a trip to the beautiful blue city of Jodhpur, but every week he's going to tell you about his travels as a photographer. It's really well put together, really well done. I couldn't be more excited about the show. Please do definitely check that out. And with that, I hope we see you again next week.
Want to learn something new and have a few minutes to spare? Well, then go for the Traveling Professor's Diary, where I, Siddharth Deshmukh, the Traveling Professor, will help you glean from all the insights that I've gained from wherever I've traveled, learned, taught, and repeated. Join me every Tuesday and Thursday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.